The day Violet Ellsworth rode into Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1878 pressing down on the prairie like a hot iron on cotton, the first thing anyone said to her was not hello, not welcome, and certainly not a word of encouragement about the man she had come to marry. It was Mrs. Opal Hatcher, the postmaster's wife, a round-faced woman with flour dust perpetually on her apron and opinions permanently on her tongue, who pulled Violet aside before she had even finished tying her horse at the post. The woman gripped Violet's wrist with flour-dusted fingers and looked her dead in the eyes with the kind of pity reserved for orphans and widows. "You are the one coming to marry Silas Watkins," Mrs. Hatcher said. It was not a question. She said his name the way people said the name of a coming storm. Violet set her travel bag down and smoothed the front of her blue traveling dress. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, gray-eyed, and considerably less fragile than she looked. She had ridden 3 days on a stage from Abilene after nearly 2 weeks on a train from Cincinnati. She had not come all this way to be deterred by a woman with flour on her apron. "I am," Violet said simply. Mrs. Hatcher shook her head slowly, as though watching a lamb walk toward a wolf's den. "I'm going to tell you something that everyone in this town would tell you if they had the nerve to say it plain. Silas Watkins is impossible to love. I do not mean that lightly. I mean that man has driven off 3 housekeepers, 2 farmhands, a business partner, and a very fine border collie, all in the span of 1 year. Violet blinked. "He drove off a dog. The dog came back," Mrs. Hatcher admitted. "But only the dog. My point stands, Miss Ellsworth. You are a decent-looking, sensible woman. I have seen your correspondence with Mr. Delaney at the agency, and by all accounts you are sharp and kind and capable. Do not waste those qualities on a man who is a wall with boots on." Violet looked down the main street of Caldwell, where the afternoon sun made everything look golden and slightly unreal. A few horses stood at hitching posts. 2 men played cards under the awning of the hardware store. A young boy chased a chicken across the dirt road. It looked like any town on any prairie. It looked like the beginning of something. "Thank you for the warning," Violet said, picking her travel bag back up. "I will be the one to measure that." Mrs. Hatcher opened her mouth, closed it, and then called after her. "Delaney's office is down the street, second left after the barber, and good luck to you, Miss Ellsworth. You are going to need considerably more of it than most." Violet did not look back. She walked down the dusty street with her bag in one hand and her chin level, and she thought about what she knew of Silas Watkins from the letters. Not many letters, as it turned out. The agency, run by a Mr. Clarence Delaney, who had handled mail-order arrangements for frontier settlers for 11 years, had told her that Mr. Watkins was 31 years old, that he owned a cattle ranch of some 400 acres 6 miles south of Caldwell, that he had never been married, that he was in need of a wife who could manage a household and was not averse to hard work. The letter from Watkins himself had been exactly 1 page, written in a cramped but legible hand, stating that he was not a man of many words but that he ran a clean operation, expected competence, and would provide a fair home and a fair life. Not warm, Violet had thought when she read it, but fair. Sometimes fair is harder to come by than warm. She had written back. Her letter had been 3 pages because she was a woman of many words, and she had felt, perhaps unwisely, that he ought to know exactly what he was getting. She had told him she could cook, sew, mend, tend a garden, keep accounts, and handle a rifle with reasonable accuracy. She had told him she was not from ranch country but that she was not afraid of work. She had also told him, in a line she had debated crossing out but had not, that she did not intend to be invisible in her own home, and that she hoped he was a man who valued a woman who had thoughts. He had written back, 1 line. "Your letter was not what I expected. Come if you want to find out whether that is a good thing." She had come. Mr. Delaney's office was small, hot, and smelled of ink and cedar. The man himself was elderly, white-haired, and had the cheerful disposition of someone who considered himself primarily an observer of other people's lives, and therefore felt personally responsible for none of the consequences. He shook Violet's hand warmly and offered her water, and told her that Mr. Watkins had been informed of her arrival date and that someone from the ranch should be coming to collect her that afternoon. "Is there anything I should know before I meet him?" Violet asked, settling into the offered chair. Delaney considered this for a moment in the way of a man carefully choosing how much truth to put on a plate. "He is not easy," the old man said finally. "But then, neither is this country. The ones who are easy usually have not survived long enough out here to mean anything." That was the most useful thing anyone told her all afternoon. She waited on the porch of Delaney's office for close to an hour, watching the town go about its business. A cattle drive had recently passed through. She could tell by the dust still hanging at the south end of the street and the exhausted look of the men in the saloon across the way. Caldwell was a busy town, a border town, sitting right on the edge of Indian territory, and it had the restless energy of a place that never quite decided whether it was civilized or wild. She liked it immediately, despite herself. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the creak and rattle of it on the dry road, the soft rhythm of two horses at a trot. The wagon that pulled up in front of Delaney's porch was old but sturdy, the kind of vehicle that had been repaired so many times it was barely the same wagon it had started as. The man driving it was not Silas Watkins. He was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a sunburned face and a wide hat and the easy grin of someone who had not yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. He jumped down and pulled off his hat. "Miss Ellsworth, I am Tommy Briggs. I work for Mr. Watkins. He sent me to bring you out to the ranch." "He did not come himself," Violet said, not accusatory, simply noting. Tommy's grin flickered for half a second. "He had fence to mend," he said. "The south pasture line went down this morning. He said to tell you he was sorry for the inconvenience." Violet studied Tommy Briggs' face and concluded that those last 7 words had not been in the original message from his employer. She appreciated the boy's kindness in adding them. "No inconvenience," she said. "Let us go." The road south of Caldwell was flat and golden and enormous, the kind of landscape that either made a person feel free or made them feel impossibly small, and Violet found it did both at once. Tommy talked the whole way, which she was grateful for, because it told her things she needed to know. He had worked for Silas Watkins for 2 years. The ranch was called Sutter Creek, named for the dried creek bed that cut across the north edge of the property. There were 1,200 head of cattle plus horses and 2 mules. There were 3 full-time hands and 2 seasonal ones. The house was large, solid, and had not had a woman in it since Silas Watkins' mother died 6 years ago. What was she like? Violet asked. His mother. Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Gentle," he said finally, "very gentle. She was sick for a long time before she passed. Mr. Watkins took care of her himself mostly. After that he just kind of," he trailed off, searching for the word. "Closed up," Violet offered. Tommy looked at her sideways, surprised at the precision of it. "Yes, ma'am, something like that." The ranch appeared in the late afternoon light like something rising out of the earth, solid and deliberate. The main house was 2 stories, built of limestone and timber, with a wide porch running along the front and a kitchen garden that had clearly been neglected for several seasons running. There was a large barn, a smaller bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and several outbuildings she could not immediately identify. Everything was functional. Nothing was ornamental. It was a place that had been built to work and had never been given time to be anything else. Tommy helped her down from the wagon and was carrying her bags toward the front steps when the door opened. Silas Watkins was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. He was tall, lean-built in the way of men who worked constantly rather than men who were born to it, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of worn copper. A deep reddish-brown that caught the last of the afternoon sun in a way that made her breath stall for just a moment before she collected herself. He stood on the porch and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was a long, measuring silence. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. His voice was low and even, like a river running deep underground. "Mr. Watkins," she said, "you made the journey all right." "I did." Another silence. Not uncomfortable precisely, but dense, packed with things neither of them were yet ready to say. "Come in," he said, and turned back through the door. She followed him into the house and got her first real look at the inside. It was clean, she would give him that. Not a homemaker's clean, but the kind of spare, disciplined tidiness of a man who did not tolerate disorder because disorder was a liability on a ranch. The kitchen was large and reasonably well equipped. The sitting room had 2 good chairs, a table, a fireplace, and bookshelves that surprised her. There were many books, some of them clearly well read, their spines bent and familiar. The dining room had a long table that could seat 8 but was set for 2. He showed her to her room, which was upstairs, clean and simply furnished with a wooden bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the south pasture. The evening light lay across the floor in long orange bars. "Supper is in an hour," he said from the doorway, "if you are hungry after the journey." "I am," she said. "I will cook." He looked at her. "You just arrived." "I know when I arrived," she said pleasantly. "Is there food in the kitchen?" "Yes." "Then I will cook. It gives me something to do while I find my footing, and it is better than sitting here staring at the walls." She paused. "Unless you object." He did not object. He simply gave a short nod and walked away down the hall, and she listened to his boots on the stairs, deliberate and unhurried, and thought, "This is a man who has learned to exist entirely on his own terms." The question is whether there is any room left in those terms for another person. She went down to the kitchen and found it well stocked, because whatever else Silas Watkins was, he was not an unprepared man. There was salt pork and dried beans, cornmeal, a crock of lard, onions hanging from the ceiling, and a basket of late summer squash from the kitchen garden that was apparently not as dead as it looked. She built a fire in the big iron stove and went to work, and by the time the light had faded completely outside and the first stars were showing, she had a pot of beans with salt pork, a pan of cornbread, and the squash roasted with onion, and a little of the dried sage she found in a tin on the shelf. It was the smell that brought him back downstairs. She heard his boots pause outside the kitchen doorway, and then he came in, and she noticed that he had washed his face and combed his hair, which was something. They ate at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, which seemed to suit them both, the formality of the larger room feeling somehow premature. He ate everything she put in front of him without comment, but he ate a great deal of it, and men who ate without comment but ate everything you made were, in Violet's experience, the best kind of men to cook for. She watched him covertly while they ate, and he watched her just as covertly, and they talked about practical things. The well was reliable. The kitchen garden needed serious attention if she intended to put it back into production. The stove ran hot on the left side. Supplies were brought from town every 2 weeks. She was welcome to the wagon and one of the horses whenever she needed to go to Caldwell, but she should not go alone after dark. Why not? She asked, not afraid but wanting specifics. "The road to town runs near the edge of territory that certain men consider their private business," he said. "Cattle thieves and worse. It is not specifically dangerous in daylight, but at night it is less certain." "I appreciate knowing the reason," she said. "I can follow a reasonable rule when I understand it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though that sentence had registered somewhere beneath the practical surface of him. "Good," he said, and went back to his supper. After she had cleaned up and he had gone back outside to check on the horses, she stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and thought about what she had in front of her. Not a bad man, not a cruel one, but a man who had built such high and careful walls around himself that he had perhaps forgotten there were things worth letting in. She thought about what Mrs. Hatcher had said, impossible to love. She thought about how she had answered it. She would be the one to measure that. The first week at Sutter Creek Ranch was a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Violet was not a woman who required conversation as a constant backdrop, and Silas Watkins was clearly not a man who offered it. So they moved around each other like two careful planets in separate orbits, maintaining a polite and functional distance while she learned the rhythms of the ranch and he watched, without appearing to watch, to see what she was made of. She revived the kitchen garden with a single-minded focus that earned her a startled look from Tommy Briggs, who had apparently never seen anyone attack the weeds with quite that level of personal grievance. She put the sitting room to rights, not moving his books or altering anything fundamental, but bringing in wildflowers in a tin cup, mending the curtain that had come half off its rod, cleaning the windows until the afternoon light came through them clear and honest. She took inventory of the pantry and wrote out a supply list in her careful hand and left it on the kitchen table for him to review. He read it, made 2 notations in the margin and left it back on the table. She read his notations. One was adding a specific brand of coffee he preferred. The other was a question mark next to the lavender seeds she had included. She left him a note under the question mark. For the garden. It keeps insects off the vegetables and the dried flowers make the linen smell better. I will pay for it myself if you object to the expense. The next morning the question mark had been crossed out and nothing further was said about it. It was small, she knew, the crossing out of a question mark, but she filed it away carefully. She had a feeling that with Silas Watkins, everything was communicated in the small things, and that the person who learned to read those small things would understand him far better than the person who waited for speeches. On the 8th day she was in the barn looking for a particular tool she needed for the garden, moving through the dim, warm smell of hay and horses, when she heard him talking. She stopped, not wanting to interrupt, and realized after a moment that he was talking to one of the horses, a big gray gelding at the far end of the stalls. Not in the gruff shorthand of practical command, but in a low, unhurried way, telling the animal that the south pasture fence was back up, and that there would be no more trouble from the Bradley boys on that side. He spoke to the horse the way some men spoke to old friends, and the horse stood with its great head inclined toward him, ears rotating gently. Violet stayed very still and watched him for a moment and felt something shift quietly in her chest, like a door she had not known was closed opening just a crack. She stepped back carefully and went out of the barn the way she had come in, and found the tools she needed from a different shed entirely, and did not tell him what she had seen. 2 weeks after her arrival, the preacher came from town, and they were married in the sitting room with Tommy Briggs and the oldest of the other ranch hands, a silver-haired man named Cal Morrison, as witnesses. The ceremony was brief. Silas Watkins stood in his good shirt, which he had clearly ironed himself that morning, and said the words clearly and without hesitation. Violet said hers just as clearly. They did not kiss. He shook the preacher's hand. Cal Morrison shook both of their hands and looked as though he might cry, and Tommy grinned so wide it looked like his face might split. That night after supper, they sat on the porch together for the first time, and the silence between them was different from the silences that had come before. It had a new quality to it, a kind of settled weight, like ground that had been planted. "I am not good company," he said eventually, in the way of a man making a disclosure rather than an apology. "I have been told this enough that I believe it." "By whom?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Several people over the years, the agency man before Delaney, 2 women before you who decided not to come when they got my letters, a business partner who left." "I got your letter," she said. "I know. And I came." He looked at her in the dark, and she could see the copper of his eyes catching the lamp light from inside the window. "You did," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that sounded, if she was not mistaken, like something close to wonder. She did not push further. She sat with him on the porch until the night sounds of the prairie settled into their full chorus, and then she said good night and went inside, and she thought as she went up the stairs that she had made a very slight but definite dent in the wall, and that was enough for one evening. The weeks that followed were a slow and careful building. Not dramatic, not rushed, but genuine and cumulative in the way that real things are. She cooked and gardened and managed the house and kept the accounts when he let her look at them, which he did, after she mentioned with studied casualness that she had kept books for her uncle's dry goods store in Cincinnati for 3 years, and found an error in his tallying for the month that had cost him $4 he was owed. He had taken the ledger from her with a look of irritated disbelief, checked her work, and then handed it back without a word and gone out to the barn. The next day the ledger was on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "If you are willing." She was willing, and he, in his own way, was beginning to show her things. He took her out to see the cattle on a warm September morning, riding beside her on his black horse while she rode the steady brown mare she had claimed as hers, and he pointed out the different stock and explained the bloodlines and what each group was worth, and where they would go when the next drive came through in the fall. He spoke with a quiet authority about the land, about the grass cycles and the water sources, and the way the wind read differently on the north end of the property versus the south. He knew this land the way she knew a book she had read many times, the kind of knowing that had moved past information and into something deeper. "You love this place," she said on that first riding morning almost to herself. He reined his horse in slightly and looked at her sideways. "It is mine," he said, as though that was both more and less than what she had said. "That is not the same thing," she said. "Half of what is mine I do not love, but you love this." He looked out over the pasture where the dry September grass ran gold to the horizon. He did not answer. But she saw something in his face, a brief softening, as though the land itself had reached up and touched him without his permission, and he was too honest to deny it. In October, the first real trouble came. A man named Gareth Bradley, who ran a neighboring ranch of questionable reputation and even more questionable cattle tallies, rode in one afternoon with 2 of his men and loudly claimed that 6 of his steers had ended up in Silas Watkins' south pasture and that he wanted them back with an added fee for the inconvenience. Violet was in the kitchen garden when they rode in, and she heard the whole thing through the open window. She heard Silas come out of the barn, heard his voice, low and flat and remarkably controlled, telling Bradley that there was no cattle bearing Bradley's brand in the south pasture, and that Bradley was welcome to ride the fence line and look himself. Bradley's voice rose. There was a good deal of language she chose not to catalog. She set down her trowel and wiped her hands on her apron and walked around the side of the house. Gareth Bradley was a thick-set man in his 40s with a red face and the kind of eyes that were always calculating something. His 2 men hung back behind him with the air of dogs waiting to be pointed at something. Silas stood between them and the barn door, arms at his sides, entirely still. "Mr. Bradley," Violet said, stepping up onto the porch. All 3 men turned to look at her. "I am Mrs. Watkins. I keep the accounts for this ranch. I can tell you with certainty that no unbranded or outside-branded cattle have come through this property in the time I have been managing records here. If you believe otherwise, you are welcome to examine the tally books. However, I would remind you that making a false accusation of cattle theft in Sumner County carries legal consequences that I imagine you would prefer to avoid." There was a long silence. Bradley looked from her to Silas and back again, recalculating. "This ain't your business," Bradley said, though with considerably less force than before. "I am afraid it is precisely my business," Violet said pleasantly. "Shall I get the ledger?" Bradley's jaw worked for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode off down the south road with his men behind him, and the dust of their going settled back into the earth, and Silas Watkins stood in the yard and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "I did not want you to have to fight him," she said simply, "and there was nothing to fight about." "There was also nothing I could have said that he would have listened to," Silas said, and there was something in his tone that she recognized not quite as shame but as something close to it, the acknowledging of a limitation. "He would have pushed until someone threw a punch. Men like that always will," she said. "But not if the fight is not in the field they expect." He looked at her for another long moment, and then the smallest thing happened. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Not quite a smile, not even close to a smile, but the nearest thing to one she had seen on his face yet, and she felt it in her chest like the first note of a song she had been waiting a long time to hear. That evening he brought his coffee to the kitchen table while she was writing letters home, and he sat across from her and opened one of his books, and they sat there in the lamplight not talking, just present in the same space, and it was the most companionable thing that had happened since she arrived, because it was the first time he had chosen to be near her when proximity was not required. She did not remark on it. She wrote her letters. He read his book. The stove ticked in the cooling night, and outside the horses shifted in the barn, and the world was very large and very quiet, and Violet Ellsworth, who was now Violet Watkins on the legal document but would always be Violet Ellsworth somewhere essential in herself, thought that perhaps the measure she had come to take was going to be more interesting than she had bargained for. November arrived with a hard north wind that swept down from the open plains and drove everyone indoors earlier and earlier each evening. Violet discovered that Silas was a reader of wide-ranging interest, that his bookshelves contained not only cattle management and land law manuals but poetry and history, and at least one novel by Charles Dickens that had clearly been read multiple times. She borrowed the Dickens, and when he noticed that same evening, he said nothing, but the next morning there was a second Dickens on the kitchen table that she had not seen before, clearly brought down from somewhere in his room, with a note that said only, "Better than the first." She read it. He was right. She told him so. He looked deeply satisfied in a private, interior way, the way a man looks when something he thought was true turns out to be verifiably true. She was learning his language. It was not a language of words. It was a language of small actions, of things left on tables, of the angle of his shoulders when he was at ease versus when he was guarded, of the way he said her name when he was thinking about something he wanted to say but was not ready to say it. He said Violet the way other men said complicated words, carefully, as though he was not entirely sure of the pronunciation and did not want to get it wrong. It was in November, on a gray afternoon with snow threatening at the edges of the sky, that she found him in the sitting room with a piece of paper in front of him and a look on his face that she had not seen before, not the usual guarded remoteness. Something rawer, something that looked almost like grief. She set down the folded laundry she had been carrying and did not ask. She sat in the other chair. She waited. After a long moment he said, "This was my mother's handwriting." She did not ask how he had come to be looking at it. She said, "Tell me about her." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you are clearly thinking about her, and because the people who were important to someone matter when you are trying to know that someone." He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The fire crackled. The wind pushed at the windows. "Her name was Ruth," he said finally. "She came out here with my father in 1861, when this was all open territory and the ranch was 300 acres and a leaking roof. She grew things. She could make anything grow, even in bad years. She was the one who got the kitchen garden going." He paused. "When my father died, she ran the ranch herself for 2 years before I was old enough to take it on. She never complained. She just worked." He looked at the paper in his hands. "She got sick when I was 24. It was her heart. She lasted 2 more years." "You took care of her," Violet said. "It was not enough." "Of course it was not enough," she said gently. "When someone dies, nothing is ever enough. That is the nature of it, but you were there, and that is something different from nothing." He looked at her, and she saw it again, that brief opening, like the door on a dark room with something still warm inside it. He folded the paper carefully and set it on the shelf above the fireplace, which is where it stayed from that day forward. "She would have liked you," he said, not looking at her, looking at the fire. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, and it came at her so quietly that for a moment she was not certain she had heard it. She held it very still inside herself so as not to frighten it away. "I would have liked to know her," she said. They sat there until the fire burned low, and then she got up and put another log on without asking, because it needed doing, and he watched her do it with that look that was not quite a smile but lived in the same country as one. December on the Kansas plains was a different animal altogether from December anywhere Violet had been before. The cold came down out of the north with a serious, focused cruelty, and the landscape that had been golden in the fall was now gray-white and enormous and absolutely indifferent to human comfort. She found she loved it anyway, in the way she loved difficult and complicated things, with her eyes wide open and without illusions. She bought wool from the mercantile in Caldwell on her next supply run and began knitting, which she had not done since her grandmother had taught her in childhood, but which came back to her hands as all old skills do, with a little patience. She made a scarf first, mostly to practice, and it was uneven and slightly too long but functional. She left it on the peg by the front door without comment and went back to her knitting. She came downstairs 3 days later to find the scarf was gone from the peg. She glanced out the kitchen window and saw Silas crossing the yard from the barn, the scarf around his neck over his heavy coat, and something rose up in her so warm and so sudden that she had to put her hands flat on the kitchen counter for a moment and take a breath. He did not mention the scarf. She did not mention the scarf. They had supper as usual. But all through the meal she was aware of the scarf hanging on the peg again where he had left it when he came in, and something about its presence there felt like a declaration, though of what exactly she could not yet say. Christmas came. She made a proper dinner, the best she could manage with what the season offered, roasted chicken and potato dumplings and dried apple cake with brown sugar sauce. She set the table in the dining room and used the 2 good candle holders she had found in the back of a cabinet. He came in from the evening chores and stopped in the doorway of the dining room and stood there for a moment looking at the table. "I did not get you anything," he said, and there was something uncomfortable in his voice, not quite shame but close enough to be uncomfortable. "I did not do this for an exchange," she said. "Sit down." He sat, he ate. He was very quiet through most of the meal, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of things being processed internally. Then he said out of nowhere, "When I was a boy my mother made apple cake at Christmas." Violet looked at him across the candlelight. "Did she?" "Yes." He looked at his plate. "This is very good." She thought, "I made you your mother's apple cake for Christmas and you are sitting there in the scarf I knitted you and you do not know what to do with what that means." And she thought, "Neither do I exactly. But we are both here and that is a start." After supper he built up the fire and they sat in the sitting room and he read aloud to her for the first time, a passage from the poetry collection she had been curious about, and she closed her eyes and listened to the low sound of his voice in the fire-lit room, and thought that this, right here, was what she had come across 3 days of stage and 2 weeks of train for. Not this precise moment, but the kind of moment it was. A moment of something being built between 2 people who had both been alone for too long. January brought a blizzard that kept everyone inside for 4 days, and it was the 4 days that changed everything. On the first day they were simply industrious together, she cooking and preserving, and he working on harness repairs at the kitchen table, their separate tasks running on parallel tracks with the easy silence they had established. On the second day, the silence began to fill up differently, because when people are confined together by whether there is no retreating to the barn or the far pasture, and the things that had been quiet in them began to be less so. She asked him on the second afternoon how he had come to buy the ranch, and he looked startled, as though no one had ever asked, and then began talking in a careful, measured way about how his father had come from Missouri after the war with every dollar he had saved, about the early years of the ranch when good years and bad years alternated without apparent logic, about the slow building of the herd and the land purchases, and the decade of decisions that had made Sutter Creek what it was. He talked for nearly 2 hours, and she listened with her full attention, asking questions that were genuine and not merely encouraging, and she watched him discover that he had things to say, that there were stories living in him that had never been given an audience. On the third day it was her turn, and he asked her, quietly, over breakfast, what Cincinnati had been like, and she told him about the city and her family and her uncle's store, and the two sisters who had married men who stayed in Ohio, and the parents who were aging now and wrote letters that were cheerful on the surface and worried underneath. She told him about the decision to come west, which had not been made lightly, which had been made after 2 years of feeling that the life in front of her in Cincinnati was a life that fit the way a dress fits that was made for a slightly different woman. Not wrong, exactly, but not right either. I wanted something real, she said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying it because it was both true and difficult to explain. This is real enough, he said, with the dry simplicity of a man who had never had cause to question the reality of his life, and she laughed, and he looked surprised, and then he made a sound in his chest that she realized after a moment was a laugh, the first she had heard from him, brief and rusty with disuse but real. On the fourth day of the blizzard, it was evening and the wind was still hammering the house, and they had run out of new things to say and retreated into books, sitting across from each other by the fire, and she looked up at some point and found him already looking at her. Not quickly looking away. Just looking openly in the way of a man who has been caught thinking something he did not mean to announce and who has decided in this moment not to pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The house held. "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this, at any of this, at whatever it is we are doing." "I know," she said, "but I want to be better at it." She set her book down carefully. She looked at him across the fire-lit room, at the man who had been described to her as impossible to love, who wore her crooked scarf in the cold and ate every bite she put in front of him and talked to his horse like an old friend and kept his dead mother's handwriting on the shelf above the fireplace. And she thought, the people who told her he was impossible to love had been looking at the wall and concluding there was nothing behind it. She had been looking at the wall and looking for the door. "Then let us practice," she said. "That is all it is, practice." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and placed his hand over hers on the arm of her chair, very deliberately, very carefully, the way a man places something fragile. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and she turned her hand over under his and held on. They sat that way for a long time, listening to the storm try to get in, the fire warm between them and the winter shut out outside, and it was not dramatic or theatrical. It was simply the most important thing that had happened to her in a very long time. When the blizzard ended, and the world came back to its regular noise and business, something had changed that could not be unchanged. He sat with her in the evenings now as a matter of course, not retreat. He asked her opinion on things. Not because he needed her opinion on cattle prices or pasture rotation, but because he had discovered that her opinion was interesting to him, that she saw things from angles he did not naturally occupy, and that the combination of her angles and his was better than either alone. She asked him, one February evening, to teach her to ride properly. She could manage the brown mare at a walk and trot well enough, but she wanted to ride like the land asked for it, flat out and with confidence. He looked at her for a moment, and something that was unmistakably pleasure moved across his face, brief and controlled but there. "Tomorrow morning," he said. And so in the cold, gray February mornings they rode together. Silas Watkins, who had grown up on horseback and whose body on a horse was the most natural thing she had ever seen, and Violet, who was learning, who fell off once and got back on before he could do more than rein his horse around with a look of swift alarm on his face. She got back on and said, "Again," and he looked at her with something she would have called pride if she had been willing to be that precise about it so early. By March she could ride properly, and they took to riding the full perimeter of the property together on clear mornings before the day's work started, which was not a thing she had suggested, and not a thing he had formally proposed, but a thing that had simply happened, because each of them showed up at the barn at the same time on enough consecutive mornings that it became a habit, and habits on a ranch become more binding than promises. It was on one of those morning rides in late March, with the first green coming back into the grass and the air smelling of thaw, that he reined in his horse at the top of a low rise that looked out over the whole south end of Sutter Creek, all the way to the horizon, and sat there for a moment with his face open to the morning light. "My father used to stop here," he said. "He called it the top of the world." She looked out over the land, the long golden-green sweep of it, the cattle moving like dark water in the distance, the sky going enormous and blue above. "He was not wrong," she said. Silas turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she watched the decision move through him like weather, and then he leaned across the distance between their horses and he kissed her once simply, with the morning all around them. She kissed him back. Of course she did. She had been waiting. He pulled back a little and looked at her, looking for the thing he was always looking for in faces, the thing that told him whether to trust what he was feeling. She looked back at him steadily and let him look. "All right," he said finally, as though something had been confirmed. "All right," she agreed, and they rode back to the house in the spring morning. And from that day forward everything between them had a new quality, something open and warm and daily and real. And it was nothing like the romantic declarations she had read about in novels, but it was better than any of those things because it was actual. Spring at Sutter Creek was extraordinary. The kitchen garden came back under Violet's attention with a vigor that seemed almost personal, as though the soil itself had been waiting for someone to pay it proper attention. She grew more than the ranch could use and began trading surplus with Mrs. Calloway, whose property bordered theirs to the east, an exchange that turned into a genuine friendship over the course of several weeks of vegetable and preserves transactions. Mrs. Calloway was a widow of 50 with grown children in Wichita, and an opinion on nearly everything. And she told Violet over a cup of tea one afternoon that the whole county had been watching Sutter Creek with considerable interest ever since word got out that Silas Watkins had sent for a wife. "The general consensus," Mrs. Calloway said, pouring more tea with the satisfied air of someone delivering important intelligence, "was that you would be back on the stage to Abilene within the month." "The general consensus was wrong," Violet said, "clearly. You have done something to that man that I would not have believed possible if I had not seen it with my own eyes." Mrs. Calloway set down the teapot and looked at Violet with frank admiration. "He came into town last Tuesday and he bid Mrs. Hatcher good afternoon when he passed her on the street." Violet was quiet for a moment. "Is that unusual?" "In 3 years of living 6 miles from that woman, the man has never once said a word to her in greeting. He rode past her on the street as though she were a fence post." Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "And on Tuesday he said good afternoon." She nearly fainted. Violet thought about this on the ride home, and it sat with her warm and fond and slightly amusing, that a man who had been described as a wall in boots was now bidding people good afternoon in the street, and that no one in Caldwell could fully account for it, and that she could. April brought the spring cattle drive preparation, and with it a great deal of organized chaos that Violet found she loved rather than found overwhelming. Tommy Briggs and Cal Morrison and the other hands rode in and out on constant errands. There were buyers coming from Wichita to inspect the herd. There were arguments about prices that Silas conducted from a position of absolute calm that she now recognized as his version of very firm ground. And there were long evenings at the kitchen table, with ledgers and maps and Violet's careful accounting, laying out the numbers in their plain reality. She sat beside him at those table sessions, and he deferred to her tallies without any ceremony about it, which the buyers found startling and the ranch hands found fascinating, and which she found simply correct. One evening after the Wichita buyers had gone and a good price had been agreed, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her and said, "I could not have done that negotiation as well without your numbers in front of me." "You could have," she said, "but it would have taken longer." "Yes," he said, and then, "Violet." Something in the way he said her name, she looked at him. He was looking at her with the directness that still sometimes took her breath away, those copper-brown eyes very steady. "I did not know what to do with you when you arrived," he said. "I should tell you that. I knew I needed a wife. I did not know what to do with a person." "And now?" she asked, keeping her voice even though her heart was doing something complicated. "Now," he said, and he reached across the table and took her hand the way he had learned to do, simply and deliberately. "You are the best part of every day. I do not know another way to say it." She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and the whole dark night outside and the house around them that was finally, genuinely, both of theirs, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing behind the wall. And it was worth every patient mile to find it." "That is a very good way to say it," she told him, and turned her hand over under his and held it. The summer of 1879 settled over Sutter Creek like a benediction. The herd was strong, the pastures were green from a wet spring, and the kitchen garden produced more than anyone had any right to expect from Kansas soil. Violet put up preserves by the dozens of jars, strawberry and plum and later tomato and green bean, and the cellar of the house filled up with the winter's proof that she had been there, that the land had been tended, that someone was paying attention. Silas rode out with her on evenings when the work allowed, which was not every evening but often enough that Tommy Briggs had begun to grin whenever he saw them heading for the barn together, until Violet caught him at it one evening and raised an eyebrow, and Tommy covered his grin with his hat and found somewhere else to be. She found out in July, quietly, without drama. She waited a few more weeks to be certain and then told Silas one morning over coffee, simply and directly, because that was the way she did things. He was very still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup with care and looked at her, and she saw something cross his face that she had not seen before, something entirely unguarded, all the careful management of his expression simply absent, and what was underneath it was wonder. "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said. "February, I think, give or take." He stood up from the table, which surprised her, and came around it to where she was sitting, and he put his hands on her face very gently, the way he touched things he was afraid of breaking, which she found both tender and faintly amusing since she was not a breakable woman. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She covered his hands with hers. "We did this together," she said. "Thank me for nothing." But he kissed her forehead anyway, and she let him, and it was the kind of moment that stays, that becomes part of the architecture of a life. The news spread through the ranch community with the speed of all such news, and the responses were as various as the people who offered them. Mrs. Calloway appeared 2 days later with a jar of honey and the kind of warm, direct congratulation that was genuinely meant. Tommy Briggs looked as though he had personally accomplished something. Cal Morrison took off his hat and held it to his chest and said he was glad to hear it, and the dignity with which he said it made Violet suspect the old man had been quietly hoping for exactly this. Mrs. Hatcher, encountered in Caldwell on the next supply run, looked Violet up and down with her bright assessing eyes, and then, to Violet's considerable surprise, took her hand and pressed it. "I said he was impossible to love," Mrs. Hatcher said. "I owe you an apology for that." "You owe me nothing," Violet said. "You told me what you believed was true." "What I believed was that he would not let anyone in," Mrs. Hatcher said. "I was wrong about what I thought was the problem. The problem was not that he could not be loved. The problem was that no one was patient enough to wait for him to figure out what to do with it." She looked at Violet with something that was, unexpectedly, respect. "You waited. I was interested," Violet said. "Waiting is easy when you are interested in the outcome." The autumn was rich and full, and Silas turned to her in 100 small ways that had become the language of their daily life, asking her thoughts on the breeding stock decisions for the following year, reading to her in the evenings with his voice that she had come to love the particular sound of, sitting with her on the porch in the cooling nights with his arm around her, while the stars came out over the plains in their thousands. He was not a man who had become suddenly easy, or suddenly talkative, or suddenly uncomplicated. He was still the same man who thought in long silences and communicated in small, precise actions, and sometimes stood in the yard in the early morning before the rest of the world woke up, and looked out over the land with an expression that was private and complete and not for sharing. But he shared more of himself than he had, steadily and without fanfare, and what he shared was good, and she valued it the more because she knew what it had cost him to offer it. In October, a difficult thing happened. Tommy Briggs was thrown from his horse during a cattle push, a bad fall that broke his left arm and cracked 2 ribs. He was brought to the house, and Violet set the arm with Silas's steady hands to assist her, having set a broken bone once before in Cincinnati, with the doctor's guidance, and knowing enough to know what needed doing when the doctor was 6 miles away in town. She made the boy comfortable in the downstairs room and sat with him through the worst of the first night when the pain kept him from sleeping, and Silas came and sat in the chair by the window for a part of that night too, and neither of them said much. But the boy knew he was not alone, and that was what mattered. Tommy healed well and was back on his feet in 3 weeks and riding again in 6, and his loyalty to the Watkins household after that was of a sort that no wage could have purchased. November arrived. Violet was large with the pregnancy now and moved more slowly than she liked, which she found irritating in a way she was not afraid to express, because she was not a woman who found physical limitation comfortable. Silas said nothing about the irritation but built a lower stool for the kitchen counter so she did not have to reach and move the heaviest items in the cellar to more accessible shelves, and said it was because the reorganization made sense, which it did, but which she knew was also for her. She loved him for the stool more than she would have loved any number of romantic speeches, because the stool was specific and practical, and it said, "I see you. I see what you need. I did the thing." That was Silas Watkins. He did the thing. The first week of February 1880, their son arrived. He was born in the room with the window that looked out over the south pasture, delivered by the midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Pratt who had seen 40 years of frontier births and moved through the whole business with calm efficiency. Silas was downstairs, sent from the room by Mrs. Pratt with the firm authority of a woman who did not negotiate on this point, and Violet heard him walking back and forth on the porch outside with a rhythmic steadiness that told her exactly how completely out of control he felt. When Mrs. Pratt opened the door and called him in, Violet was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and she watched Silas Watkins cross the room to her with the expression she had loved most in him, the one that was entirely unguarded, the one that was all the way real. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, at this new person who had arrived into the world they had made together. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your jaw already." "He is very small," Silas said, with the careful observation of a man noting something he did not entirely know how to categorize. "He will grow," she said. "They do." He reached out and the baby caught his finger with a grip that was absurdly strong for something so new, and Silas made a sound that was low and involuntary, and Violet pretended she had not heard it because she knew he would want her to. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Silas looked at her. "You had a name in mind." "I had too," she said. "I thought you might choose." He looked back at the baby. At the small face, the copper-brown tinge around the eyes that would either settle to brown like his father's or gray like hers, too early to say. "James," he said, "after my father." She had not known his father's name was James. She filed it away in the place where she kept all the things he told her, carefully and with full attention. "James," she said. "James Watkins. Hello, James." The baby did not respond to his name, being 3 hours old and primarily occupied with the business of existing, but he held on to his father's finger with that improbable grip, and Silas looked at him, and something in the set of his face was changed in a way that she understood was permanent. Spring came again to Sutter Creek with the crocuses and the new calves and the kitchen garden going back into the ground, and Violet Watkins, née Ellsworth, who had ridden 3 days on a stage from Abilene and 2 weeks on a train from Cincinnati to marry a man she had been told was impossible to love, found herself in the particular happiness that is not dramatic or theatrical but simply deep, the kind of happiness that is built rather than arrived at. That is made of 10,000 small choices and specific kindnesses and patient mornings, and honest words and hands held across tables and scarves kept on pegs by the door, and the sound of a voice reading aloud in the evening, and the look on a man's face when he comes in from the cold. There was the afternoon in April when she was in the garden with James, who was now 2 months old and had discovered that the sky was interesting, and Silas came out of the barn and stood watching them for a moment before he thought she had seen him, and his face was completely open in the way she had learned only happened when he did not know he was being observed, and what was on his face was so straightforwardly, completely happy that she had to look away to give him back his privacy. There was the evening in May when a letter arrived from her sister in Cincinnati, her younger sister Clara, who was newly married and struggling in the way of new marriages, and wrote a letter that was cheerful on the surface and frightened underneath, and Violet read it to Silas at the kitchen table, and he listened the whole way through and then said, with quiet certainty, "Tell her it gets better. Tell her the hard part at the beginning is building the thing. Once you have built it, you know what you have." She wrote exactly that and sealed the letter and thought, "You built something here too. You just did not know it while you were doing it." There was the July morning when James, who had been lying on the blanket on the porch, got his first proper look at his father on horseback, and laughed, an enormous delighted sound from such a small person, and Silas reined in his horse and looked down at his son with an expression that was helplessly pleased. That was all the love he had always had, and not known what to do with finding somewhere new to go. Mrs. Hatcher stopped Violet in Caldwell one late summer day and said, with the blunt honesty of a woman who considered honesty a point of personal pride, that she had been wrong and she wanted to be on record as having said so. "You were not wrong about him being difficult," Violet said. "I was wrong about impossible," Mrs. Hatcher said firmly. "Those are different things, and I should have known the difference. Difficult is just the part before you find the key. I looked at Silas Watkins and I saw the lock and I called it the thing itself. You looked at it and started looking for the key." "I was curious about what was on the other side," Violet said. "Well," Mrs. Hatcher said, smoothing her apron in a gesture that was part satisfaction and part closure, "you found out." "I did," Violet said. She had. She had found a man who was not easy and was not simple and was not given to the quick warm graces that made other people's company feel effortless. She had found a man who kept his dead mother's handwriting on the shelf above the fireplace and talked to horses like old friends and built stools so she could reach the counter, and held his newborn son's hand in both of his with the concentration of a man who understood that some things are irreplaceable. She had found that impossible was not a fixed condition, that it was, in most cases, simply a measurement that had been taken too soon by someone who had not been willing to wait, or curious enough to stay, or interested enough in the person behind the wall to go looking for the door. She had measured it herself, and what she had found was not impossible at all. The harvest of 1880 was the best Sutter Creek had seen since before the years of hard drought in the early 70s. Silas rode the land in September with the settled satisfaction of a man who has done something right across many years, and he rode it with Violet beside him and James on her hip, because James at 7 months had strong opinions about being left at the house when interesting things were happening outside, and being carried on a horse qualified as extremely interesting. "Your father called this the top of the world," Violet said when they reached the rise on the south end. "He did," Silas said. "He was right," James said, though what he actually said was an emphatic syllable that bore no relation to words, but his face was turned up to the enormous sky with an expression of absolute open wonder, and his parents took it as agreement. The prairie ran to every horizon, the grass golden in the September light, the cattle dark and small in the distance, the sky a blue that had no equal anywhere. It was wild and real and enormous and theirs, and they were in the middle of it, this family that had been built one small, careful, honest thing at a time, and the world around them did not know or care about any of the choices that had led to this moment. But the people in that moment knew, and they held it, and it was enough. That winter Silas surprised her. It was a small surprise, but a significant one. He had been working on something in the evenings for several weeks, in the barn after supper when she thought he was doing harness work, and she had not asked because she respected his private projects the way he respected hers. On her birthday in December, which she had not expected him to remember because she had only mentioned it once and in passing, he brought in a small wooden writing desk, handmade, with her initials carved into the front panel in precise, careful letters, VEW, Violet Ellsworth Watkins. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. The carving was not ornate. It was not furniture made by a cabinet maker. It was made by a rancher who had worked on it in his spare time by lamplight, and the care of it was in every line. "For your letters," he said. "You always write at the kitchen table, and the light is better in here in the afternoon." She turned and looked at him, and she did not say anything, because there were moments when the things she felt were bigger than the words available, and this was one of them. She went to him and put her arms around him, and he held her in the solid, present way that was entirely his, and she thought, "Here, this is what impossible turned out to be." In the spring of 1881, their second child arrived, another boy they named Will, after no one in particular, but because the name suited him from the first moment, a smaller, louder, more immediately opinionated version of his brother, who by now was walking along furniture edges with fierce determination, and regarded Will with the deep suspicion appropriate to someone who had materially changed the household's attention dynamics. The ranch grew. Silas bought an additional 80 acres on the east side from a family moving north to Colorado, and Violet managed the accounts for the purchase with the same calm precision she brought to everything. And when the transaction was complete and the land was theirs, Silas stood at the kitchen table looking at the deed and said, quiet and certain, "None of this would be the same without you." She thought about the woman who had gotten off the stage in Caldwell 3 years ago, the one who had been warned away from a man described as impossible to love, the one who had said she would be the one to measure that. She thought about everything that measurement had found. The horse and the scarf and the stool and the desk and the 2 small boys and the evenings by the fire and the mornings on the south rise and the hands held across tables and the voice reading in the lamplight. "It would not be," she agreed. "And neither would I." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am not the same person who came here," she said. "This place changed me. You changed me. I am better for it. So the gratitude runs both ways." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man taking something in fully before he could respond to it. Then he said, "I did not think I was capable of this, any of it. I want you to know that I know what you did." "What I did," she said, "was stay interested. Most people are not interested enough," he said. "I am aware of that. Most people take measurements too quickly," she said, "and then argue with the number they got." He looked at her with the warmth that had become so natural in him now that she sometimes forgot he had not always had easy access to it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did, that particular small movement that was his equivalent of another man's open smile. "What did your measurement find?" he asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the rancher who had been described as impossible to love, at the man who was in fact fiercely capable of love, who simply needed someone willing to stay long enough and care enough and look closely enough to see what was already there. "It found something worth measuring," she said. He came around the table to her and kissed her in the easy, unself-conscious way he had learned, and she leaned into him, and the boys were making noise in the next room, and the ranch was running outside the window, and the Kansas sky was wide and blue, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Outside, the land that had been wild before men came to it, and would be wild long after, was going about its ancient business. indifferent as always to the small human particulars happening on its surface. But inside Sutter Creek Ranch, on a Thursday afternoon in April 1881, everything was particular and specific and present, and the woman who had been told the rancher was impossible to love held her husband's hand in both of hers and proved, as she had promised herself she would, that the word impossible was only ever a measurement that had been taken wrong. The years that came after were not without difficulty, because the land and the time made certain kinds of difficulty unavoidable. There were dry years and hard winters, and the troubles that came with living on the Kansas plains, in an era when the frontier was still being negotiated at considerable cost to people who had not been consulted on the negotiation. Violet was not unaware of the world beyond Sutter Creek, of the displacement of the Kiowa and Comanche from the territories just south of them, of the violence that periodically erupted along the lines that had been drawn without their consent, of the human cost that the word frontier obscured. She thought about these things and talked about them with Silas, who was a man of his time and therefore imperfect in his understanding, but who was also, at bottom, a man of practical fairness, and who listened when she spoke and changed his mind when the evidence required it. They gave fair wages and fair treatment to the seasonal workers who came through, and when Tommy Briggs decided to take on a piece of land of his own, southeast of Caldwell, Silas helped him make the purchase and Violet helped him keep his accounts in the first year. And the day Tommy rode out on his own horse to his own land was a day that both of them watched from the porch with the particular pride of people who have had a small part in something good. Cal Morrison retired in the fall of 1882, his hands too stiff for the heavy work now, and he moved to Wichita to live with a daughter there, and his leaving was a genuine loss, the kind that is not replaced but is honored by remembering. Violet wrote him letters, and he wrote back in the large, careful hand of a man for whom writing did not come easily, and his letters were short and full of warmth, and she kept them in the writing desk he had never seen. James, who had been born to the sound of his father pacing the porch, grew into a boy with his mother's curiosity and his father's steadiness, a combination that was formidably effective. Will was louder and more immediately warm, quicker to laugh and to anger and to come around again, with the particular energy of a second child who has always had to be slightly more demonstrative to be heard. The family they were was not a perfect family, because perfect families do not exist, but it was a genuine one, built on the particular foundation of two people who had met as strangers and learned each other one honest, patient day at a time. They argued sometimes, because Violet had a sharp tongue when she was tired and Silas had a stubborn streak that could run a week if he was convinced he was right, and their disagreements were real disagreements, the kind that had to be worked through and not around. But they worked through them, because both of them had made in their different ways the same fundamental choice: to be present, to be real, and to keep choosing each other. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, Silas brought her to the South Rise at sunset, just the two of them, the boys left with Mrs. Calloway, who had become over the years something close to a grandmother to them. They sat on their horses at the top of the world and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plains in a riot of orange and red and the particular gold that only the prairie sky could make. He had something in his coat pocket, and he brought it out and offered it to her. It was a small piece of carved wood, no bigger than a river stone worn smooth. He had been working it with a knife for some time, she could tell. It was shaped with some simplicity like an open hand. "My father made one of these for my mother," he said. "I watched him. I could not remember exactly how he did it, but this is close." She took it from him and held it in her palm. It was warm from his pocket. She looked at it for a long moment. "Silas," she said. "It is not much," he said. "It is everything," she said, and she meant it absolutely. They sat there until the sun was gone and the stars were beginning and the prairie night was spreading out around them, enormous and quiet and full. Sutter Creek was dark below them, the house lights small and warm at the foot of the rise. the place they had made together out of hard work and patience, and the particular courage of people who are willing to be honest with each other and keep going. She put the carved hand in her own pocket and held it there, and she looked at the man beside her, the man who had been impossible to love, who had turned out to be something else entirely, who had been worth every mile and every patient day, and every small, careful, real investment she had made in looking past the wall to the person behind it. The night gathered around them, and the horses were still, and the grass made its low, constant sound in the darkness, and Violet Watkins held the carved thing in her pocket and thought about the question that had been the beginning of everything: whether a man who had been called impossible to love could be loved, whether the measurement that everyone else had taken was the right one. She had taken her own measurement. She had taken it every day since she arrived, in every small thing and every silence and every hand held across a kitchen table, and what she had found was this: there is no such thing as impossible to love. There is only not yet loved well enough, not yet waited for long enough, not yet truly seen. And the person who does the seeing, who brings the patience and the curiosity and the willingness to stay, that person is changed by what they find just as much as the one who is found. She was changed. He was changed. The home they had built between them on the Kansas plains, 480 acres of grass and sky and cattle and kitchen garden and books and firelight and 2 small boys, was the physical form of that change, was the proof that something had been built where before there had only been solitude. The stars were fully out now, the Milky Way a river of light above the prairie, the same sky that had been above this land before any of them arrived and would be above it long after. Silas reached over and took her hand in the dark, and she held on, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already said. Below them the lights of Sutter Creek burned warm and steady in the night. The cattle were quiet. The horses in the barn were settled. The boys were asleep at Mrs. Calloway's house. James curled around whatever book he had managed to take to bed with him, while talking to himself in his sleep in the particular running commentary that characterized him, even unconscious. Everything that had needed to happen had happened. Everything that had been uncertain had resolved itself into certainty. The woman who had been told the rancher was impossible to love had come and stayed and looked and found. And what she had found was the full and complete opposite of what she had been told. And the fullness of it, the completeness of it, was as wide and deep as the Kansas night around them, as solid as the limestone walls of the house they would ride back to, as real and lasting as the hand she held in the dark. They rode home under all those stars, and the door opened to warmth and lamplight, and the smell of the apple-wood Silas burned in the evenings, and they came in from the night and closed the door on the cold, and Violet set the carved hand on the shelf above the fireplace next to the piece of paper with his mother's handwriting, and it was exactly right. The two things side by side, the one that had come before and the one that had come after, the continuity of it. The love moving through time from one generation to the next, the way the land itself moved from one season to the next, always changing and always the same. This was what she had come to measure. This was what she had found. And it was, beyond any reasonable accounting, more than she had dared to hope for when she stepped off that stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, with her travel bag in one hand and her chin level, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that the only measurement worth trusting was the one you took yourself.